Thank you very much, Hassan, and thanks so much to Dr. Adeli to come all the way from the Persian Gulf. I appreciate it, and also the other people who come from London and other places for this session. The purpose of these panels or these discussions basically is to have more connection really between the people who are interested in Iran and the professionals who actually work on Iran. And we are also having a training workshop, which Hassan didn't mention, in Istanbul, thanks to donation we received from Iranians who are interested in creating a technocratic group who would be able to help Iran in the future as we go into the next phase, if you like. Iran, as you all know, is not only very, very important, strategically located, but it's got huge resources, not only in terms of oil and gas, but also human resources. We should not forget that many of the young people are here. And the point is that with this in mind, I think it's very important to have a technocratic group to be able to have a good relation with the rest of the world and develop the resources of the country. And we are poised to do that. Although we don't have any slides. So let me explain. I think I remember what's on the slide, and I have to time myself, like so well was done by Dr. Adeli. There's no point fighting the technology, especially if it's from Trinity College.
I think we need to switch to natural gas here.
Yeah, I think so. I can come on, if you don't mind. Yeah, if you don't mind, I come there and I come back to that. This set of slides, maybe if I press these buttons, maybe I don't know whether it works. It has no real effect. So basically, what I'm going to talk about, you really don't need some of the time. Hopefully when we need the graphs, you'll see them. What I want to talk about is first actually talk about the state of Iranian economy. I thought many of you are here want to know what is the play, what is going on, what's happened since Mr. Rouhani in particular has taken over. There's lots of information about it out there, but I thought I'd go to the Central Bank of Iran sources and what is available, and actually not to replicate whatever is on internet, which is always a danger. So I'm going to talk about that and tell you some of the data that exist. Then I'm going to talk about something I actually talked in Iran about a year and a half ago, was about what I think is the endemic problem of economic management in Iran. What I call the problem of episodic foreign exchange crisis and high and persistent inflation. And I think it's so important to resolve this problem for Iran if we want to go further, if we want to actually develop our gas resources and other resources, we really need to solve that problem. And there are fundamental political, economic issues related to this resolution of this episodic problem of crisis and inflation, which is not related to usual sort of economic policy people talk about, controlling the interest rate or controlling liquidity or money supply. I'm going to convince you actually you need more fundamental thinking in order to resolve that problem. The second thing which is related to that is what I call populist policies in Iran. And I think this is the fundamental issue in many countries in the world, but in Iran, because of revolution, has been endemic. In a sense, it's something which revolution created the populist regime. And it's very difficult to move away from the slogans of the revolution. Marx knew about it, and we all know about it too. Every revolution has a slogan. And the best revolutions, as many people have pointed out, is to find out how to move away from the slogans. And I think this is something we need to talk about. I'm going to talk about that, talk about subsidies, cash handouts, and also the sort of providing housing, the Maskan Mer. Most people know about this project. And the last one, which less been talked about now, but I'm going to talk about it, we could have implication in the future, which is called Saham Edalat, which is justice shares. So I'm going to talk about these three fundamental problems. You see, all of these three are symbols of populism, if you see what I mean. And the question is, how do you map this symbol of populism with reality of economic situation in Iran? And I don't think that whether sanctions are there or not is going to solve these problems. In fact, my fear is I'm going to indicate removing of sanctions is making it more difficult to solve these problems, ironically. So you have to wait for it. So now, and then I'm going to talk about a bit prospects of Iranian economy with or without sanctions. Okay. Sorry that you can't see this, but this is more or less what is on the page. So you haven't lost anything. Now, I'm going to talk about first sanctions. I think everybody wants to know about it, and everybody has already familiar with all these issues. The key is the US-EU sanction. Iran has been to 2012, which we all know. Iran has been subject to sanctions for over 30 years, since the hostage taking. And Iran has managed to deal with sanctions in many ways, costly to Iranians, but has managed to deal with it. I've always said sanctions is not the way to change political will of a nation, and have been on record many times, and it's been repeatedly, basically not verified, been shown by the data, in the following sense, that if the sanction doesn't work in the short term, it's less likely to work in the longer term. Why? People adapt to it. Of course, they become poorer as a result of it, but because they don't know anything better, it's a counterfactual problem. Nobody says what would have done otherwise, because they say it's a military operation. They are against us. What do you expect us to do? So therefore, it's provide a pretext for the regime not to do anything better than they are doing. And then also it creates a political climate inside this, which basically creates this political economy consideration, which some people benefit from the sanctions, and has a huge, if you like, wealth implication. And it creates these populist policies to sustain themselves. And what is actually the other point, which is actually important for the Congress of the US to realize, that the fact that Mr. Rouhani came to negotiating table, it wasn't the fact that the sanction changed the political will of the regime, but it actually was the democratic political movement inside Iran which voted for Mr. Rouhani. There were 6 different candidates. They could have voted for any other ones, and then there were other ones they didn't want to negotiate at all with the West. So if Iranian people wanted to have no negotiation with the West, they would have not elected Mr. Rouhani. So this argument that somehow sanction has worked, therefore have more sanctions, is a fallacious argument, because it does not follow necessarily. So it's important also, I've written something about that later on. But what is important to realize, that this popular democratic response for the change of status quo has been really important for the negotiation which we are actually experiencing. That's actually an important point to bear in mind later on. Let me now talk about the effect of the sanction. What happened? So the previous sanctions were important, but were not detrimental to Iranian economy. Everybody knows that. The most important sanction was when EU and the US combined together. And it was not only that, also for financial sanctions. So it was when the US government basically sanctioned the Central Bank of Iran. In fact, that day I got a call from Wall Street Journal, and asked me, is it a good idea for US to sanction central bank? I said no. I still believe that, because it would create a new area of, in other words, you could have an Asian area which create their own financial system. But it may take a long time for that to happen. So basically, what the sanctions did, obviously the oil production fell, we all know, by about 1 million barrels per day. And then has it recovered since then a little bit. It's gone to 1.2 million barrels, the latest data which is available. But at the same time, domestic consumption of oil continued to rise because of the subsidies, which I'm going to talk about later on. And the subsidies, as we saw, was tried to be moderated, removed. But because the subsidies were set at the nominal level and inflation were rising, in fact, the relative subsidy has, in fact, increased, ironically. And then oil production is rising. Export really, in a way, is even now less than the total domestic consumption. And if you think about the data, you'll see how distorted the production and consumption and export of oil has become in Iran. And I'm going to say something about I will just put one line in the gas trade, because I knew that Dr. Adil is going to talk about it. And I think what his data suggested is exactly what my conclusion is here, that although Iran, I said the second largest, but obviously almost the second largest, or the first largest gas reserve in the world, Iran remains a marginal player at the moment. Of course, it's got huge potential. I totally agree that there would be an important area as well. So we have this is the production side. What about what happened to real economy? In real economy, these data from Central Bank of Iran, anybody can download them. It's all in English. So people say, where did you get this data? And often when I talk about Iran, they say, is data true? I said, excuse me, making up data, national account data, is not easy. I'm sure Dr. Rioli knows that. I mean, any change in one item creates havoc everywhere else. And if you imagine, if you make a mistake, if you misreport your income for 1 year, suppose your income was $100,000 and you misreported $200,000 to show off, right? What happened the year after? You keep increasing, you keep showing off more, right? Sooner or later, you realize you cannot sustain it. So it is very difficult to lie with the data. That's why Mr. Ahmadinejad forced the central bank to change the data. No data was published for a number of years. Okay, so this data is as good as any other country, in my view, if you ask me. There may be it could have been more accurate, but I think it could be either accurate up or down. So if the mean of it is about right. But the data clearly shows that the sanction had a dramatic effect. Never had this effect before. It dropped by 6.6% in the year of the sanction. Not all oil, because Iranian non-oil sector is quite large relative to the oil. It's not just because of the oil production has fallen. But then the production also fell another 2.6% the year after. There is no data, confirmed data, but estimates suggest that this year, the Iranian financial year, which ended in March of this year, has gone up by 4%, but we don't know. That's an estimate, and people expect it to rise by 2% in the next. This is the current Iranian year, which is again very moderate size. So therefore, Iran has actually been held back. If you think about an economy with the size of Iran, which is about 78 million people, quite connected to the rest of the world in terms of internet, in terms of the population at large, and the trading partners which are surrounded Iran, it is huge potential for Iran. It's quite clear to me that if there is opening up takes place, Iran will grow quite fast. Not necessarily because of it would be sustainable growth, but because of catch-up growth. You will have a catch-up growth is going to happen. But sustainable growth requires changes in the reform of the financial and the subsidy and other systems we talk about, right? So basically, this is the story about the output growth. But what is interesting, when you look at the data, actually, I myself was surprised. I hadn't looked at this data. I looked at the consumption. You find the consumption was protected. You know, if you look at, we know that from economic theory that income fluctuates more than consumption because we do consumption smoothing, even if we do it in our own households. But consumption smoothing has been quite considerable. If you look at the 2 years where the output growth fell by average of about 4.2%, consumption only dropped by 1.4% on the 2 years average, while investment declined by 15.4%. So therefore, you are saying that the effect of the sanction is affecting the potential of the economy, has affected the people as much. And that's very important. They didn't let it to affect the people as much through the mechanism. So therefore, that's why there was no real objection in the system, because the consumption didn't rise, but didn't fall that much. So in a way, but then if you don't invest, the future consumption cannot grow, right? So that's the issue you need to bear in mind. And the private sector has been basically relatively sheltered as a result of these financial sectors, and investment has been taking the brunt. Now, this is more graphical thing, which actually shows the picture, although my data is more up to date towards the end. But that also shows you the oil price has also fallen, which is added to the problem. Although oil prices, as you see, about recovering, is going back above $60 as we speak. And people expect it to go back to about $80. I think Iran shouldn't ever plan their economy that oil price would be $100. They should plan it about $65 to $70. So therefore, this fluctuation shouldn't really affect the Iranian economy if you have a proper mechanism of dealing with or some kind of like oil stabilization fund. The second thing happened, we all know that the EU-US sanctions resulted in foreign exchange crisis. In fact, the third one of them was first experienced by Dr. Adeli. I'm going to talk about it, you see from the graph. Let me move to the graph very quickly because you may miss it. So basically, these are related to some of the political economy issues going to talk about. So if this is the actual nominal exchange rate, the red one is the official rate, and the blue one is the free market rate. And notice here we have these three crises which we're going to talk about. The first one, and what is interesting, I looked at the timing of this crisis and where they fall in each different presidents. Rafsanjani, Khatami, Ahmadinejad. So guess there will be another one towards the end of Mr. Rouhani's period. I don't bet on it, but I'm quite highly sure of it's going to happen. And why it's going to happen, I'm going to tell you in a minute. So therefore, these gaps, these are not sort of accidental. These are really related to fundamental economic forces operating. So the first crisis was 92, I think, 91, 92. The second one was 2004, 2005, and the third 2012, 2013. But if you take it in the logarithm scale, you find that the recent one was not as big as the previous ones. And then the log scale is important because in economics, it's percentage changes which matters rather than absolute values. So if you look at the log scale, it's the same graph, believe it or not. It's the same as this, except I have taken log scale. If you take log scale, you find that actually the first one during Rafsanjani, after Rafsanjani, was the biggest one. And in fact, that inflation went up a bit higher. The second was relatively small. Well, as you can see, the steps are becoming smaller and the gap opening, and the gap is closing quicker. So the central bank learned more in the last episode, is reducing the gap quite quickly. So I have to show you some data on inflation. I can't do it, so I'll come back. So I'm going to show you what has happened to the inflation, but I think some way I've got managed somebody to get all the data and put it together. I'd really like you to see it. So I come back to that. Anyway, the bottom line was that inflation basically obviously rose, we all know, but I want to show you what's happening now, really now, what's still yesterday. So what happened, inflation went up to about 45%. During the first episode that Dr. Al remembers, went up to higher, 50%. And then all these episodes, the inflation goes about 45, 50% and comes down very quickly, but then it stubbornly doesn't move. It does not go down below something like about 10, 12, 15%. And current level of inflation, month of this year to previous year, is about 15%, the official data that Pesaran also announced just a few days ago. But I'm going to show you the data later on. So the point is therefore, what is going on? What are the economic causes for this kind of event, episodic? I call this episodic. It happens ever so often. It's like a pressure cooker, right? The way to think about it, the most analogy I can give you is like a pressure cooker. There's a pressure dynamics in the system, and then you put some water, they heat the water, you start heating the system. Now there is enough safety mechanism that you can hold it. The pressure doesn't get released, get held for political reason, I explained that, and then it gets to the point that it cannot be sustained. Then there's a needed trigger. It's like an avalanche. So your avalanche builds up. If you look at the way it works, earthquake is similar. It builds up, the pressure builds up, then a trigger would just unleashes it. So most people say, the trigger is the cause. Of course, it's not the cause. The trigger just triggered it. It basically, but it's very difficult to know the thing. So it creates this vicious circle. So these episodes of high and persistent inflation, as I'm going to talk about persistent inflation later on when we see the graphs, they actually happen, as I said, 1990, 92, 2004, 2005, 2012, 2013. And actually, if you look at the time difference between them, there may be not exactly about 8 to 9 years, but about that amount of time it takes. And what it turns out, that is actually the amount of time it takes for the law of one price, or what I call present poverty, to work. So it's not sort of unconnected to the fundamental forces we know. And I'm going to show you when we get the picture. So let me just now, what is happening, it creates what I call a vicious circle. It doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that the financial exchange crisis is the cause of inflation, but it doesn't mean that inflation by itself is a cause of financial exchange crisis. It means that the two interact together. Let me go back very quickly to the data on inflation. So this is the key data. It's a consumer price index, CPI. Now, let me tell you what the difference between blue and the green is. The blue data is the annual rate of change, which is the average of the index over a year relative to previous year. For example, you see the 50%, which was the previous crisis. Coincide with that. That's the 50%. Maybe even higher. It's exactly 50%, I think. That's the annual data. So what has happened, what I have done here, I've created a monthly movement relative to the month of previous year, the green one, to show you what exactly happening now. And these are, unfortunately, for those of you who don't read Iranian one, these are Iranian months. which come from central bank data. So what's happened, the inflation went up to 45% here, which people know that where the crisis was, is fallen quite dramatically. In fact, I gave an interview, some of the, in Iran a few years ago, they asked me what's going to happen. I said inflation would fall about 10%. They said, how do you know? It's 45%, it's very high. I said, look at the previous periods and look at what the mechanism is, it would do it. And it actually happened. But what is happening, notice here that inflation is stubbornly now staying here. In fact, it's gone up a little bit. It's not going down anymore. So you have reached the level of political problems again. I'll come back to that. So if you now go to producer prices usually more versatile. That you notice here, sorry, that's the food part. Sorry, I didn't see what I'm showing you. So this is the food part. What I'm going to show you, actually the part which is become very stubborn is the food. So notice here that the rate of inflation of food is started to rise again. So now this is the 10%. Is it? Yeah, it is a. This is the 15. That's the 10% level. So basically, you can just see that's gone up again. It's started going up. So that's the food component of the index, which is very important for masses. So that become the key. Now, if you look at the producer prices, you see similar pattern, but more volatile. If you look at export prices, however, notice here that the export prices fall much more dramatically. It's actually in negative region. So the reason is that Iranians, because of the sanction or other impediment, they're actually undercutting the market in order to compete. Partly also because of the petrochemical prices which has fallen, because Iran, a large part of non-oil export is petrochemical. So basically, this data show you that inflation is not just going to go away that easily. This is the consumer price index, and that's the food component. So at least it just suggests that you can't just rely on the present mechanism to get rid of the problem. So let me just now go back to that's the theory. I'm not going to spend too much time, but it was in my slide. I thought I'd take it out, but I said, no, I keep it. Why not? So basically, this is the fundamental law between prices domestically and abroad. Hume originally came up with the idea. But we don't have to be as strict as Hume, which had the law of one price, which basically says that domestic prices are proportional to the exchange rate multiplied by foreign prices. If you basically import a pair of shoes from Europe, from France, and the P star is the price of shoes in euro, you multiply by the rate of exchange of pound by euro, it gives the pound what that shoe would be in pound. Of course, it wouldn't be identical to that, because the taxes could be different, the transportation costs could be allowed for it, but we do not expect this proportionality to systematically either go up or to systematically either come down. That's the key model. That's enough. As soon as you say this K has to fall within a range, then it means that it is inevitable that there has to be a balance between the rate of change of your inflation, foreign inflation, and exchange rate depreciation or appreciation. There is no way out of it. That's the pressure cooker, if you see what I mean. This is basically the equation of the pressure cooker. So what happens if you look at the data, basically the only thing is, especially when countries have got their government intervening, and there are lots of mechanism which you could go around the system a little bit. It may take longer, or it may take shorter, but all evidence suggests it takes about 6 to 8 years for this to work. So in other words, if there is an imbalance, the pressure cooker give it 6 to 8 years time. It will build up, and then sooner or later, it would release itself. Now, I'm going to show you data. So, of course, in Iran, like every case, when you do a case study, well, there are many different factors. Iran had a large oil income, so sometimes they would allow the government to control the short-term movement, stop the exchange rate to fall, just because they have the capacity. Sometimes they have more of that capacity, sometimes less. Except the only country I've seen they haven't really tried to do that is Norway. I was actually having lunch with the governor of Bank of Norway. It's really amazing what they've done. Everybody tell me oil is a curse. I say visit Norway. Now, the other thing is the presence of multiple exchange rate confuses this law, makes it difficult to work in some sense, and also economic and financial could also impede in the law. But eventually, nothing controls it. It's got a life of its own. Let me just give you the data now. So the way we did it, I've done some work with Kamyar, who has been helping getting this thing to work. So basically what this is that actually if you take a log scale, but you do a weighted average of the free market rate and official rate. Because of the multiple exchange rate, we need to construct something which is combine the two. And this, whether you put 0.7 or 0.3, 0.8 or 0.2, or what, doesn't make much difference to the result. Because as you saw, the government exchange rate would come back to the free market rate. So therefore, whatever I put, in the long run, it doesn't make much difference. But then if you look at now what the law, suppose you want to compare this law with the US. You could compare, obviously Iran doesn't trade with US. I'm going to do it with all other countries, but compare it with US. It says that if you are, this is the blue one is the Iranian inflation rate, quarterly rate, and the red one is the US inflation rate. And look at the difference. Of course, the difference is huge, right? So basically, if you accumulate them, I developed the concept for some of Iranians to follow this law. I call it tavarrum tarakomi, which basically what I call it cumulative inflation. So we basically, instead of just looking at one point, accumulate all of the area under the blue line, like integral, and accumulate all of the area under the red one line, look at the difference. What that difference should be the rate by which Iranian currency would depreciate by the law. Has to be, right? So basically, this is what it says. Now, if you then try to actually plot the cumulates together, you find that obviously there are gaps between the two. There are disequilibrium here, but then they map. This is coincide with the first crisis, second crisis, and third crisis. So you can see, I don't need to look at the exchange rate. I look at the cumulative inflation, nothing with exchange rate. I get the same picture logically as I would have done if I looked at the exchange rate. So therefore, they are mirror image of each other. So basically, that's if you model the thing and shock the purchasing power parity, it would take about 6 to 7 years. That's an analysis of that. If you do the same across other countries, you find that this law is not just, because a lot of people say, is a special anything about Iran? No, Iran is not a special. A lot of people in their own country is always a special. It's not, unfortunately. No, everybody the same subject. That. If you look at Brazil, this is the inflation, accumulation of inflation. This is the FX, the depreciation of the currency. If you look at the difference between the two, these are the numbers which are almost about zero, or something which could reflect some special features of that period. So basically, if you look at Iran, this bang on, the difference is about 0.6. So basically, this is if the law holds, exactly you should see zero here. But notice here you have Argentina, which is 58%, 1% difference. So therefore, this argument that this cumulation of inflation would then have to be matching with the exchange rate depreciation is going to be there. Iran has to face it every time we do it. So basically now what's going to happen that this vicious circle would start unless you break the back of inflation. Meaning, what does it mean breaking the back of it? You need to bring it to the level of the rest of the world. What is the rest of the world inflation nowadays? In UK, it was negative last month. It's become just slightly positive. In Euro area, it's about 1%. In US, it's about 1.5%. In the whole world, in the trading part that we have, it's about 2%. Now, of course, there are some countries who are higher. So I think my view is that Iran has to have a policy to bring the inflation below 5%. Below 5%. And sustain it. That is the key for any future success of Iranian economy, with or without sanctions. Okay, so that's the first lesson. Now, the second point, because I want to have time for our discussion, the question was, I went and looked at many other Latin American countries and Turkey and other countries. How did they manage to solve the inflation? Although some of them really haven't solved it yet, but they did a good job. And you find that all of them fare better than Iran in some way, because all of them had a high inflation rate, some way above Iran. Iran wasn't that high during 79, 2004, but then when you go 2005 onward, the inflation was being no difference. So Iran hasn't done anything effectively in controlling the inflation. Still, this is the 18%, which is really difficult to move. Now they have moved it to 15%, 12%, and that is the problem. Now, of course, what are the solutions? I mean, here, the failed policy. I'm not going to go over them. Don't do them. During the Shah, somebody talking to me about some Iranian newspaper about what happened during the Shah. I said one of the problems was Shah thought you can solve every problem by importing. So we said we don't have doctors, import them. We don't have roads, bring people to build it. So this wasn't a solution. So it wasn't also a solution during the Shah to go and criminalize the people who sell goods at high prices. So we don't want to do that. And so you cannot really use monetary policy or just indexation of price of wages or this kind of strong arm tactics to solve the inflationary problem. Because you have to go at the core of the problem, which is the imbalance in the Iranian economy. And where is this imbalance? One of the ways that Brazil actually solved it was, you don't see it now, the governor of the Central Bank of Brazil in 1994, 1999, he was given the task to deal with the problem without political intervention. In fact, the parliament in Brazil agreed to this. They said, we do not want to politically intervene. Because they knew if they were to involve themselves, they have constituencies. And every constituency want to get a part of the pie, and they would not agree with each other. So therefore, they had to have an arbitrator which cut through the political demands of different groups. And so he has this phrase, you don't see it here, but he made the following comment. People and their political representatives voted to give themselves things they could not afford. That was his main argument. I repeat it. He thought that what was happening in Brazil, that the people, the population at large, and their political representatives, democracy or non-democracy is not the issue. You could have a totally democratic system, and still you vote for having more of the cake than you can afford. Right? Greece is the example in point. So you have a political, and their political representative voted to give themselves things they could not afford. That is, in my view, is the cause of Iranian endemic inflation. Not economic arguments. Economic issues are there. Mismanagement has been there. Corruption has been there. Politically motivated decisions have been there. Obviously, nobody denies it. But at the end of the day, you need to deal with the problem of fiscal responsibility and creating a confidence in the system. So in the case of Iran, what you really need, which is obviously some people, hopefully in the new environment, if the sanctions are gradually removed, you really, what I call, you need a new social contract. You really need to talk about what that contract is. What is it that each group in the society are entitled to? And what each group in the society are responsible for producing in some way. Now, of course, doesn't mean that the market mechanism could not help provide some of the solution. But because Iran has oil, and we are hearing that is likely to have gas, revenue from gas as well. These are all means the more important to develop a political system to deal with external revenues, which is like quite complicated to analyze otherwise. So in a way, we need to recognize there is to be balance between individual demands and aggregate economic realities. So the whole point of a market mechanism is to solve that problem. In Iran, because of revolution, because of the history, we haven't been able to address these issues through the market. So therefore the question is, how would you do it? You really need to take charge of these issues. I'm not saying the market, some of you may sit in here, I'm not of a believer that the market will solve all these problems. So therefore, I am not suggesting a market answer to Iranian problem. Market is a part of the solution, not the total solution. So basically, the other problem is because of the revenues from oil is volatility of oil export, and the sanctions have further complicated these calculations. Now, in the case of the sanction, I've already discussed them. We have done a recent study which just came out as a working paper, was presented at the last conference we had on Iran, the association had on Iran. And I want to show you some pictures of this. This is nothing to do whether you had a sanction or not. You take any economy as a part of world economic system, and you shock the oil supply of that country. We have the same graphs for Saudi Arabia. We have it for Norway. When I was there, that's what they were interested in. What happens if there is a shock to Norway oil supply? They were interested in that. So I was there because of that. We have done with the Saudi Arabia. This is for the picture for Iran. What is happening in the case of Iran, which is quite clear, that the first thing which happens, the production of Iran, the output, GDP, it falls. And notice here, the number here, you may say, well, oh, this number is very small. This is a quarterly rate. So it is 1.5% per quarter. If you multiply by 4, you get the 6%. You get the impact 6% we got actually happened. So this is really matches with the data. Now, Iranian inflation goes up, if you look this here. But by the way, this band, the red band means the critical values of this thing. If this, the blue is way outside the 0, it means it's highly statistically significant. If the blue lies between 0 and 2 reds, it means it is not really significant statistically, in the sense that it may be 0. maybe have no effect. So what you see that the effect is mainly operating on oil out on the output. It hardly affects the oil prices. Some of you are expert on oil. Dr. Takin is here. What happens if Iran, reduces the oil production? Not much in the world anymore. It did before, but even now with the reduced oil production, nothing. But what happened to inflation? The inflation goes up slightly, but as I said, it's not statistically significant after 1 or 2 quarters. So therefore, the fact that inflation has risen wasn't because of the sanction. It's because of those fundamental problems I've already told you about. And also the sanction is gone, the inflation come down, but it still is high relative to the rest of the world. So therefore, notice here that, in fact, the exchange rate, the real exchange rate doesn't get affected. Of course, the nominal exchange rate gets affected. But the real exchange, what matters in economy is the real exchange rate, which is the ratio of the nominal divided by the price level. So what is happening, yes, the exchange rate depreciates, as you all saw, from 1,000 to 3,000, big, but then the prices also rise. When you look at the ratio, nothing has happened. People, if they stay in their homes, buy whatever asset they have, sooner or later, after 4 or 5 years, they realize they would be all right. Those are the losers who go and sell very quickly. Okay. So basically, that's what the story is. Now, because I want to have more time, so I'm going to speed up a little bit now. Now, basically, you need, obviously, you could have policies which counter the effect of the sanctions. Clearly, tourism, I don't mean tourism from the Europe or America, from the neighboring countries and Muslim countries could be really important way of dealing with the sanction in Iran, and people have done that. I know that the present government has been doing that. But obviously, you really need to deal with the reforms. The most important to deal with the oil export volatility as well. Now, this is a problem which actually I thought being solved during Dr. Khatami's presidency. There was an oil stabilization fund, but it was raided. This is the key. Iran needs to develop these infrastructures. You really need some kind of oil stabilization fund. Now, remember that all the data suggests the same thing. The more volatile your economy is, the less you're going to grow in the long run. If you look at the data, scattered graphs across all countries in the world, we get the same answer. Now, the important thing is look at the other countries. There have been a number of sovereign wealth funds in the Persian Gulf, but the most impressive one by far is Norway. Norway has developed this, what they call now government pension fund, which basically is not a pension for today, they mean pension for future generation. The governor told me actually he was against changing it to the word pension fund. He would like the oil fund, just without any name to it, because if you say pension fund, people think they need it. In fact, anybody in Norway can go, even the tourist guy said to us, you just go and press a button on the central bank, it tells you every second how much your money is changing. So it's totally transparent. Iran should do the same. It would be great publicity. So Iran, this is the amount of fund we have. And they have 400 people in Central Bank of Norway to operate this fund. The fund is now stand at $887 billion. It's gone down. It used to be 1 trillion about 3 weeks ago because the market has fallen. It could easily go up to $1 trillion. $1 trillion. How much is it per person? It's about $170,000 per person. Right? This is what they have done. And this is an economy which, when you see their oil prices domestically, is higher than many countries in the world. Why do we want in Iran to say because we have oil, we have cheap oil? What is the logic to that? So basically, I think we could model, I'm not saying we could follow Norway, but we could at least think about what they're doing and try to emulate them, in my view, in this area. The problem was Iranian recognized it, IMF recognized it, the Oil Stabilization Fund, but what happened that Mr. Ahmadinejad, he came and raided the fund. Everybody knows about that. And the problem was that he created a National Development Fund. When I saw the article of his association, I said, gosh, this is a fund for the president. It's not for the country. And the fund was investing inside Iran. The whole logic of this fund is not to spend the money inside the country, is to keep it outside. Of course, Iran, because of sanction, cannot do it. But hopefully one of the benefits of the removing the sanction, in my view, would be to reinitiate the Oil Stabilization Fund and keep our asset and share what is the prosperity of the rest of the world through the asset return. And the other interesting is that Norway, I was very interested to talk about this, that Norway doesn't use the fund except the return. Hicks was a famous economist. He argued, what is your wealth? It depends how much you can eat from it, which your wealth remains constant. So basically what Norway is doing, he said if the return on the asset is about 4%, I actually don't think 4% is good enough. It's probably 2.5% it should be, but they were optimistic. What is the wealth that runs? My view is about 2.5 to 3% real terms. You can then use the 3% every year from the fund, and the fund would never goes away. So that way you can initiate a lot of development inside Iran. To me, this is the most important institution Iran has to build if the sanction ends and we start building the economy. It is a must. Not only for reducing volatility, but also building up the assets and sharing with the prosperity of the rest of the world. You need to also manage expectations. You know, how do you manage expectation? You have to be transparent. You have to give the central bank more independence. I know that Dr. Adil has written a pamphlet on it many years ago. I'm not suggesting Iran that can become, central bank become independent. I'm not naive. I said to the extent possible. But you need to move towards it. Somebody asked me, how do you appoint the central bank? I said, the question is not how you appoint them. How do you make them to resign? Nobody listened to me, as usual, right? People discussed it. I said, the most important is that the president cannot basically force the central bank governor out, like in the US, like here. So we could do that. We don't have to give total independence, but we can at least do that. That's very easy. You just say no one can remove the governor of central bank once appointed unless there have been criminal charges against him. And our parliament can initiate that. Now, institutional reform, it's clear to me that's fundamental, that you need to have a balance between private and public sector. Financial stability, bank reforms, we all know how important they are. And most importantly, investing more in education infrastructure. Iran has been very fortunate, not because of the regime, but because of the people and household. They really want to educate their children. And look at the number of girls going to school. It's a pleasure that to see 60% of Iranian entrance to the education system is female. And that actually could be very important for future Iran as we speak. Now, of course, the interest rate policy of the bank is related to another law. We need to, I think they are following that in Iran at the moment. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. The most important I want to spend before I finish is energy subsidies. Energy subsidy has been killing Iran. And not only because opportunity cost of the energy used inside Iran could be invested abroad and create capital and infrastructure for the country, but also it distorts all economic activity inside Iran. The size of it is huge. So these are the data. So I wrote an article with Dr. Salih Esfahani, who is another member of the board of our association. This is the data for Iran. This is basically everything is measured relative to ratio of price to a benchmark. And the benchmark is basically the cost of the oil in the Persian Gulf. So basically what you see, Iran have been fluctuating, but it had been a downward trend. This is when Mr. Ahmadinejad had a reform of energy. But notice here, it didn't take very long to go down again. In fact, it's gone down even further. But if you look at what is Norway, Norway is this dotted line. They have oil. They have this price, relative price of energy, and look at ours. Lowest in the whole region. Now, what is going to happen? Okay, what they did, the worst thing anybody could do. You want to reform energy, you give a cash hand. The cash which is given to everybody remains. The benefit of energy subsidy is gone because inflation has eroded. Because the energy prices were set in nominal value. You should have the set of the ratio. You should control the ratio of domestic energy prices to some benchmark, not the level of it. And it's very easy to do. So it's quite clear to me, without a reform of that energy subsidy, you will not work. The country is not going to function. They have been timid in order to deal with it. The present government, they started discussing it, but obviously they haven't followed it. So then there is another important issue is housing and building and construction. Most of their asset is in their houses, if they are lucky to have one. And clearly, it's a very populist move to try to say, I'll provide house for everybody. You really need to use the banking sector, the properly worked out risk assessment to be able to do that. You can't just do it, just hand out houses to people and infrastructure which is associated with it. And that has been something which I was told that the amount of money that the bank markets has to give for this project, which is called the Maskan Mer, that this project, 40% was about 40% of monetary base of the country. Just give you the magnitude of the injection of the fund inside the economy. So what if sanctions get removed? Let's talk about that, because we don't know. I think that I thought about it. You know, it's speculative. We don't know whether sanction ends or not. But sanctions, when they are, has been very particularly prolonged in the case of Iran. There have been huge distortion in the Iranian economy, and there have been important shifts in income and wealth distribution because of the sanctions. So if the sanctions removed, all of this has to adjust back. And it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be quick. So please do not expect any miracle. Now, that's the positive side, because that removing the sanction definitely is going to increase the growth. It's going to be quite good investment. People come to invest. You can see a lot of activities opening up, the gas production, everything else. But what is that? It's important to realize that also removal of the sanction does something else, which you think is good, but as economic point of view, let's think about it. It's going to increase government revenues from oil and gas exports. And it's going to also get more money from unfreezing of Iran's foreign exchange assets. What does it mean? Iran become like the Shah. We had a lot of money suddenly, which didn't really expect and didn't plan for. Has there been a blueprint for Iran what is going to do if they have a lot of money tomorrow? What's going to happen? So that is the problem. You would definitely get project coming after. People come after people to persuade Iran to invest in this, invest on that, domestic, outside. And if you don't have a plan, you don't have a strategy, you waste the fund. I'm fearful of that. I have to tell you as an academic person. Yeah. So it's good, you get more money, but it's like somebody who won a lottery ticket. If they don't know what to do with the lottery, they may ruin themselves. Now, this in turn could reduce the urgency of reforms and continuation of the past and current populist policy as well. If you have more money, reforms is going to be put on a back burner. Urgency diminishes. And the populist policy would be in the vogue again, because there would be more demand from the people who say, well, now the sanction is gone, what about us now? So these are real problem issues. You really need to think about it. I read a lot. Nobody mentioned any of these things. I hope I'm not the only one to think about it. It's so obvious, right? It's very important to remember that this reduces the urgency for reforms. Obviously, initially, the economy will grow quite fast, but this could bring about a further inflation because of endemic problem we have. Inefficiencies could be in some area and could lead to another FX crisis, the foreign exchange crisis, sooner than we even imagine. It is also important to resist fast economic expansion, as I said earlier, without the necessary reforms and the policy adjustment needed in response to sanctions removal. So government should start thinking about what should be their policy response. I don't know whether anybody inside Iran at the moment meeting to decide what to do about if the sanctions are removed. Is there a blueprint? Somebody should ask, right? That is the key. I don't know any. I know why people don't do it, because they say, oh, we don't know if it happens or not. Iranians say, wait and see. But the whole point of economic planning is not to wait and see, to have contingency plan. And that's, I think, to me, is very important. We need to start doing it now. I'm not worried because the sanctions are not going to be removed overnight anyway, so we have time. So you need to develop policies in place to deal with the removal of sanctions. Just to finish, in this talk, I've basically provided an overview of the current state of the Iranian economy. I've focused on some of the, what I call proximate and fundamental causes of endemic inflation, which is to do with the political, populist, if you like, regime, in the sense that it's come from the slogan of revolution. So it's very, very deep-rooted, very difficult to move. I've also identified issues and policy problems that needs to be addressed. And there are clearly structural problems that face the Iranian economy. And clearly we need some reorientation of the political economy away from populist policies and towards improving supply condition and competitiveness. By the way, I am not against providing a safety net for Iranian people, but I think it's very important that it is in line with the realities of Iranian economy. You need supply condition. Iran is coming out of isolation, has to be more competitive. You can remain uncompetitive under isolation, but you cannot afford to be non-competitive when you come out of isolation. And we Iranians have to come out of isolation and find our place in the world as we deserve. And finally, the removal of sanctions will not, as I said, resolve the structural problems. Clearly, they can create more problems unless we deal with them. Sanctions have distorted the Iranian economy, and the most urgent issue will be how to readjust the economy after the sanction, if it happens. Iran needs to prepare for the coming out of isolation. To succeed, Iran needs to become more competitive. I will stop there. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.